Okay, so when we talk about religion and morals, I think I've mentioned a couple of times in the course of the term that thanks to this sort of Enlightenment mentality, you know, your Thomas Jefferson Bible that takes out all the narrative and miracle stories and just puts in the Christian teaching, or Kant's idea that the only thing that could point you to the idea of God is reason, and reason in relation to morality. There's this sort of modern understanding that religion is just about morality, right? The Ten Commandments. It's all about, the first time I ever taught this class, the young man who immediately started complaining about, religious prudes trying to tell him how he lived his life, as if that was the sum total of what religion was about. And, there are reasons that people have that sense, sometimes just based in the misunderstandings of our modern culture, sometimes based in the way certain religious people may act and talk. But I've said that that's not all there is to religion, and I want to maintain that. At the same time, we cannot deny the importance of morals, rules in relation to religion, right? So you have the Ten Commandments in the Hebrew faith, right, and underlying the Christian understanding of reality. In Buddhism, you have the five precepts: training rule of no killing, training rule of no stealing, training rule of no sexual abuse, training rule of no dishonesty, no alcohol and drugs. Those are training rules. Those are the basic rules. If you ever look at Buddhist monastics, they have many, many more rules. That's just the start. If you're a Buddhist, if you want to begin to follow the Eightfold Path, that's step one, right? It's those five precepts. We have this sort of Americanized version, oftentimes, of Buddhism, like it's just this sort of, you know, sort of floaty spiritualism, ethereal, we don't like rules, so when we think of Buddhism, oftentimes we don't grasp the level to which rules play into the idea of the Eightfold Path of coming to this sort of balanced life. Within modern Judaism, the rabbis historically have looked at the law, not only the Ten Commandments, but the whole of the Hebrew law, and they've come up with the idea that there are 613 commandments within the Old Testament law. Islam, I've looked in the past, there's not really, the focus of Islam is that God is one, and there clearly are rules. There are five pillars of Islam, which have to do with reciting the statement of faith, the Shahada, prayers, fasting, giving to the poor. But there are also other rules, things that you shouldn't do, should do. Some coming straight out of the Quran, some coming out of the traditions, sayings, and actions of the prophet and his immediate kind of contemporaries, the earliest Muslims. This text called the Hadith, which is a collection of their sayings and doings, and there's different versions, different. There's some core collections that pretty much every Muslim holds to, and there's some that are debated by different schools of thought within Islam. Some people have conjectured that there are maybe 100 specifically different commands within Islam, but there's no exact count like the rabbis have. Within Hinduism, the rules are very caste specific, but they are rules, right? One caste should do something, another caste should not even try to do it, right? So if you ever read the Mahabharata, which is a great epic sort of story of Hinduism, the main character Arjuna is a king. He's a warrior, and so the incarnate god Vishnu, who's there as his chariot driver and champion, Krishna, um, tells tells Arjuna, you shouldn't be worried about killing or being killed. Killing is nothing, right? He's a warrior. That's what he's supposed to do. He's supposed to go to battle and fight for his rule and his people and his country, and so yeah, you kill. But the priestly class, the Brahmins, they're not even supposed to like kill an animal, much less a person. Um, and then obviously a warrior is not supposed to just murder someone in cold blood, but there are caste specific rules. Certain castes can do certain jobs, other castes cannot do those jobs, right? But there are clearly rules. Rules are a part of it. Um, you'll find some disagreement in the different religions on those rules. Within Judaism and Christianity, there are rules that are across the board pretty much for everyone. Within Hinduism, you have that caste. But there are some points on which all the major religions tend to agree. And I just want to emphasize here, I'm not claiming that all religions are the same. I will say again and again, we're going to get into that in a couple of lectures here, or what are some of the key differences. But before that, there are points, especially relating to ethics, on which all the religions tend to agree. And not only with each other, but they agree with Socrates, right? Socrates, this is why I start out with reading him. If you remember from the Gorgias, the regular and orderly states of the soul are called lawfulness and law, whereby men are similarly made law-abiding and orderly. And these states are justice and temperance, right? Temperance is this idea of self-control. That, for Socrates, is central. And that's honestly that's the goal of most religious moral teachings, right? That you're to learn, that if you remember the five precepts in Buddhism that you saw, right, in that earlier slide, right? The training rule, right? These are training rules. The Apostle Paul in the New Testament, in his writing, he talks about the law, the Old Testament law, being the schoolmaster, the to train, right? It's not the end all be all. It's not the point. It's not the objective. It's sort of the trainer, the one who's putting you in the place to develop real virtue. Right? So what is this idea of temperance, right? Why temperance? It's self-control. It's the understanding within Plato, from Socrates, right, or within the religious traditions that there's no amount of outward control significant to really fully order society. People must be self-controlled. Um, they must learn to govern themselves. This involves concern for others, and quite honestly, this isn't just religious systems. Every system of human society, they have to deal with the way we interact with others. And those dealings with interaction with others usually involve things like physical well-being, right? Property rights, sexual integrity, truthfulness, mental and emotional stability. If you want a stable society, if you want a stable civilization, these things have to be governed and guarded. And Socrates, Plato, and most of the major religious traditions they're gonna potentially provide kind of stopgap measures for individual personal inward failure. They're gonna provide for means of instruction and means of correction from the outside. But the goal is usually that recognizing the need for right physical well-being, that we don't injure other people, that we don't poison other people, that we don't murder other people, that we respect the rights of others to their property, their home, their crops, the fruit of their labor, as it was, that we have some respect for sexual relations. There's a certain level of sexual integrity. There may be nuanced differences from culture to culture, but there's always going to be some means of protecting sort of sexual relations. Why? Because sexual relations produce more people, and it produces offspring, and it affects inheritance, and it affects, um, you know, familial stability. There's all kinds of things, not to mention, sexual integrity related to emotional stability and physical well-being, right? There's a thing within love called jealousy. Um, it's a maybe there's a spiritual element to it. Maybe there's just a mental element to it. Maybe there's some aspects of it that's cultural, but some of it's just straight up biological chemical. You have sexual ties to another human being, and you feel certain things for them. You are biologically and chemically tied to them in ways, and so it's going to produce feelings and attitudes, and connections. And so you want to see a society get disordered quickly, is you have no sort of protection or integrity to sexual relations. You just let it, you know, the idea that sexuality can just be this free for all is not going to order, society in a stable and structured way. Like I said, there may be different rules. There may be easy for divorce, difficult for divorce. A person may be allowed, you know, usually in most cultures, and a lot of people are like, oh, it's maybe there's a sense in which it's related in just sheer physical strength, but that usually you don't find very many cultures where women are allowed more than one spouse at a time. You will find cultures where men are. Um, the reasoning behind that has usually to do with inheritance and tracking family. Um, right, it's important to track who the parents are. It's pretty easy to know who the mom is when you have a baby. Um, it's not always easy to know who the dad is, and that creates problems not only for inheritance but for things like, I don't know if you've seen some of the stuff that people are talking about now with, sperm donors. People are realizing that, like, there's this one, I saw a write up the other day about this one sperm donor who has like hundreds and hundreds of kids that he doesn't know, and they don't know each other. Well, oh, what's the big deal? Well, you don't want to marry your half brother or half sister. If you don't know who your half brother or half sister is, that creates problems. So if you think of an older culture, not sperm donors, but if you think of, you know, um, we got to know who mom and dad are. Um, it's a whole lot easier to track who mom is just by sheer watching, observation, and biology. Um, if you know who dad is, there needs to be some social structure that gives you some kind of assurance that that really is going to be the dad. So that's why every culture has something to do with it. They have some laws, some rules, some structures that guard that. Um, the question of truthfulness, right? There are cultures where, um, being able to trick someone is seen as clever and good, but there, even within those cultures, there are always rules. There are always kind of stopgap measures, certain instances at which you should never break this. Like, so, you know, um, why is that? Well, how do you do business honestly? How can society hold together if you can never trust anyone? So, you get Solzhenitsyn's criticism of the rule of law, but there does at least have to be the rule of law. So in our culture, like, someone can tell you they're going to do something, but it's going to be hard to hold up in a court of law. But there are standards, there are contracts and things like that that breaking them can get you into serious trouble. Why? Because it's hard to have stable business without some measure, some standard, some process of guaranteeing, um, reasonable expectations of truthfulness. So every culture has to deal with these things, not just religious cultures, every single human society. So in every society that's throughout history, there's always been a religious element. Humans are, one theologian calls humans Homo adorans, not just Homo sapiens. In other words, um, beings that are conditioned to worship. That's just part of what we do. And so, and if you don't believe that, just look at the popularity of, uh, you know, Taylor Swift, or, um, you know, people's actions at a football game. There's a form of worship going on. There's this sort of total abandonment to the moment, to the celebration of the perceived greatness of someone outside yourself, right? That's a certain aspect of worship. That's why, you see the person whose whole yard is decorated with, a sports team or something. They're devoted to it, right? That's, we tend to do that. And so every culture's kind of worship understanding of the world, of the universe, of the transcendent, of the natural, it all involves some aspect of these ideas of concern for others in relation to these things. That being said, the religions are going to tell you that, okay, we're going to set rules to govern those, but you also should learn to be self controlled. I would argue that the major religions also tend to agree not only with Socrates and to some level with each other, but also with the Rolling Stones. And this is on a deeper level, right? If you're familiar with I can't get no satisfaction, I try and I try and I try. It's this idea of no matter what you have, no matter how much stuff you have, no matter how much entertainment you have, um, sort of looking at the whole advertising industry, you're just driven to seek more and more and more, and you're never satisfied. Um, every one of the major religious traditions has religious literature that recognizes this sort of human dissatisfaction with stuff. And so you'll sometimes see not only similar, you know, um, underlying ideals, but even similar explanations of it. This idea, why is that? I mean, if you're dealing with an ancient culture and an ancient culture and an ancient culture, even if they're in different parts of the world, there are going to be similarities based on their technology, right? Um, in this day and age, I could probably go anywhere in the world, just about, and use a metaphor from a car engine or a metaphor from a soccer game, right? Doesn't matter if you're talking about Portugal or Egypt or why? Because in spite of all of our differences culturally, geographically, historically, cars and soccer are a huge part of just about every culture on some level around the world. There are probably a few way out in the middle of nowhere that, yeah, they don't have that. But for the most part, um, people can connect on things that we share as human things in our world. So when you read the Katha Upanishads, or you read Plato's Phaedrus, or you read the book of James in the Bible, you find this interesting discussion of self-control and the need for the passions to be controlled. And they all make some connection to horses and horses being reined in. James is the simplest. James talks about the bit in the mouth of the horse controlling the horse. And the Christian objective, as James is laying out, is to not have to be controlled, in essence, by the bit, not have to be controlled by pain, but to have a transformed heart so that you do live right. But there is this recognition of that image, right? Plato's Phaedrus, the Katha Upanishads, they both have this idea of a chariot driver, and the horses are um, each of the examples with the chariots a little bit different from the other, but there's this strong similarity of idea of passions and appetites, being the horses. Um, the passions are more the more noble horse. The appetites are the less noble horse. So you want the passions to control the appetites, and you need the reins to control the passions and the appetites. And the reasoning person, or for the Katha Upanishads, the sort of intellect, which is sort of higher, deeper spiritual reality even than your reason. In the Katha Upanishads, the reins are the reason, and the intellect is the controller of the reins, is the driver. Um, but they have these shared images because they have these shared experiences, and because they're all dealing on some level with a shared human need for all those things that we talked about. Now, why is this? Why within every culture you're going to find rules on marriage and sexuality, on property rights and defense of human life, and certain sort of standards for the sake of health and emotional stability, social well-being. Right? Why? Why is that? Because it's the necessity of human existence, right? And quite honestly, it's a recognition of our condition that there are certain things that are real about us that require certain actions. So, if you don't know what that is in that picture, those are like little watch batteries or something of that sort, right? Those little tiny batteries, those button batteries. They all have this, right? This sticker on them: harmful if swallowed, keep away from children. There have been all kinds of public safety announcements, labels. They're even starting to put bitter coatings on them, really, really bitter coating on these little button batteries because children have swallowed them and it kills children. They're very dangerous. So the bitter coating makes the child's immediate reaction be to spit it out if they put it in their mouth. This is a human reality. Some things exist in a way that, well, they then require certain actions, right? Which I would argue every one of the religions, along with Plato and Aristotle, and quite honestly, just the realities of human life, they defy Hume's is ought problem. I always find it strangely interesting that Immanuel Kant, one of the kind of greatest modern, post Enlightenment Western thinkers, writers, one of the key people everybody goes to when they talk about ethics in the modern world, modern study of ethics, Immanuel Kant. He was inspired to do everything he did. He was challenged by Hume's is ought problem, right? You can't get, Hume says logically, you can't get an ought from an is. But the reality of human life is that we always get oughts from what is, right? Because a button battery up here will kill a child ought not swallow them, right? Because a button battery can kill a toddler and they look interesting to a toddler, grown-ups ought to do certain things with them to keep the toddler from swallowing them and getting killed. Because they are deadly, dangerous, and tempting to a toddler, an adult ought not hand a button battery to a child, a small child, right? This is what this little symbol over here means. Don't give these things to little tiny children. They will swallow them and then they will die, right? Because this battery has acid in it that if swallowed by a child will eat the children's stomach and they will die a very slow and painful death that it's really hard to save them from, if at all possible. Because that's the case, they shouldn't be given to children, right? That's is ought. That's how we live life. Every religious culture, because every human culture has had to say that. And so we share some similarities on that. We're going to see that. If you haven't already read some of those religious passages, hopefully you have, and you should look for and see some similarities between those. So the is ought problem, I would argue, is not a problem. It's human reality. Finally, I did mention in the context of the horses, right, and the chariots and the desires and appetites, or we might say passions and appetites, right? These aren't exactly the same thing when we're discussing religious ethics and the ideas that we're talking about here with, the Rolling Stones, the lack of satisfaction. Socrates, when he's arguing with Callicles, right? This idea of what is it that you want versus what seems right. Right? What you really want, is good things. So you'll see this in every religion as well. This tension between your desires and your appetites. Within Christianity, it's kept pretty straightforward in the sense of desire, appetite. They're kind of a drive. You should teach yourself to have an appetite for the higher, better things, right? So Jesus says at one point, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. The Apostle Paul at one point writes, it is my ambition, whether, here or home, alive or dead, in essence, still on earth or taken up to heaven, to be pleasing to God who sent me, right? So that's, what is that? That's an ambition. You should have right ambitions. Buddhism, on the other opposite, like when it comes to talking about differences in religion, there's so many between Christianity and Buddhism, but there are some similarities here. Here's one of these similarities, right? Buddhism seems to say tanha is the source of suffering, and what you want to do is get rid of suffering. And so you should get rid of tanha. Well, what is tanha? Tanha is a word in Sanskrit, but it usually gets translated desire. And so if you read it wrong, if you don't understand the nuance and the culture and the context, you'll miss the point, because Buddhism says you should get rid of desires in order to not have desires so that you don't have suffering. Because if you don't want anything, you can't lose anything, you can't lack anything, and therefore you won't experience any suffering. Interestingly enough, part of the Eightfold Path is right desire. So Tenha cannot be just straightforward and only desire. But every religious tradition, every one of the major world religions is going to tell you on some level there are these desires and there are these appetites. And they don't, on some level, and they're not treated as the same way. You should have desires for what is right and good, and those desires should control your baser, merely biological human appetites. And so that's going back through the Rolling Stones, it's going back through Socrates in Plato's writings, right? Temperance, self-control. You have to deal. You're going to have rules and standards that are sort of the model for how you should shape your heart, your life, your desires, the way you should control your appetites inwardly, so that you can live in sort of peace, tranquility, right relationship, stability in relation to the gods or God, the universe, and your fellow human beings. Every religion is going to have a strong kind of similarities on those levels. They're all going to see those issues, those ideas, and have rules relating to those types of things.